This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. Ahead of us today on this Wednesday's programming, we begin with Sandy Johnson, a beef reproductive specialist here at K-State. She speaks with us about reproductive technologies and the upcoming Applied Reproductive Strategies in Beef Cattle meeting in San Antonio, Texas. Also ahead, we have K-State weed science specialist Sarah Lancaster. She joins us for a conversation around herbicide-resistant grain sorghum technology and controlling Palmer Amaranth. We end with this week's Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Expert segment, where the experts cover a listener's question regarding bovine anaplasmosis. That and more awaits us ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are with Sandy Johnson. She is a beef reproductive specialist here at K-State, and today she's joining us to talk about reproductive technologies. But to start with, we're going to talk about a meeting that you have coming up that's going to be really exciting and something that producers may be interested in attending, and that's the Applied Reproductive Strategies in Beef Cattle meeting, and it's going to be August 30th through the 31st. So, Sandy, why don't you tell us a little bit about that meeting?
You bet. You know, from my perspective, what can be better than 2 days about talking only about reproduction? You know, I mean, everybody's dream, right? And we've actually hosted this meeting a couple times in Kansas, so our producers are somewhat familiar with it, those that have attended. I work with a multi-state group, and our aim is to help producers better use reproductive technology and how to improve their reproductive efficiency. And so, you know, we'll talk about things from improving heifer fertility, bull fertility, reproductive herd health, all those types of things. And producers should know that even if you can't attend live, that we have lots of those materials archived on our website, beefrepro.org. And as we think about the future, you know, what we're going to talk about here is kind of the gateway to the future and what we might do.
Absolutely. And I didn't mention this, but that meeting, like you said, it's been previously held in Kansas, but this year it's going to be held in San Antonio, Texas.
Right. Down on the Riverwalk. So.
Excellent. A great location, a fun one for sure. So hopefully producers will check that event out. But like you said, we're going to be really focusing on reproductive technologies and kind of the future of those technologies. But as it stands right now, we have a basic understanding of them. What are some of those technologies that we're really utilizing currently?
Right. So, you know, right now I think people think of artificial insemination or AI and embryo transfer. And I think in the future, those are going to be kind of our basic skills. The ability to use AI has always been largely about selecting the genetics you want, and our ability to determine what are the best genetics and how quickly we can do that is just really evolving. And so anybody that's able to utilize AI as a basic skill now will be able to incorporate essentially what's on the horizon from the genetic standpoint. And there's lots of things that they're working on that are really pretty exciting in terms of being able to improve our production efficiency.
Absolutely. I think that's something that's often missed, is that critical relationship between reproductive technologies and, like you said, the genetic side of things. It's such an opportunity to make those improvements, especially when it comes to talking about cattle.
Right. You know, our typical generation interval in cattle is 6 to 7 years. And, you know, right now, if we really wanted, and some of this is being done in the dairy industry right now, so we can take this prepubertal dairy heifer and aspirate some oocytes, do some in vitro fertilization, and we've DNA tested the newest bull calf we have and selected which of those from a DNA standpoint we want to use. And we can do in vitro fertilization. We can do some DNA testing on those embryos. Now that reduces our viability quite a bit. But even if you allow those to go to term and DNA test that newborn, you know, you're really speeding up that generation interval. And you would think about typical 6 to 7 years. And now we're looking at something more like the hog industry. That's some significant changes. And you know, the challenge will be, are we smart enough to determine what are the best genetics? They're working on some things like the slick hair gene. Now, we could spend years and years trying to incorporate that into our genetics naturally, but it'll take a long time. well, if we can use genetic technology to incorporate that slick hair gene into some of our cattle right now, and you just think about the heat we've been having last week in particular, how valuable would that be to the industry?
Absolutely. I think there's so many genetic advantages that could be made the most of with this technology. In your eyes, you mentioned that slick hair gene. What are some of the other areas that you would like to see improved specifically in beef cattle?
Right. So right now we're able to use sex-sorted semen, and our results with that are improving, not quite as good as with conventional semen. But they're also looking at trying to do some genetic modifications. So say a bull only produces male offspring. Okay, so then we could use natural service. And if I want to target a terminal market, I'm just creating male calves. And in the beef industry, our best in terms of producing harvested product is going to be the male side. On the pork industry, the female is leaner and has some efficiencies. So being able to raise the genders or the sexes that we want can really create some efficiencies. And the other thing we can do then, we can do this to extent now, but want to get better at it, is say that I want to create replacement heifers that are F1s or maybe a Hereford Angus cross, and doing that with bulls because my numbers of animals gets kind of hard logistically. Well, can I create those either via AI or embryo transfer? It simplifies the breeding process. Now, in some people's mind, well, AI is too difficult, but those that have learned to use it have really found that the payoff is certainly worth the investment.
In terms of some of those opportunities to learn about the AI process, does K-State have some opportunities for producers to become more well acquainted with that technology?
Well, there are a variety of ways to learn AI itself. It's a skill that takes repetition, and students on campus are getting that. Many of our semen providers provide those schools, and then we have a couple of commercial schools that are available in Kansas. And then from an educational standpoint, we do like to share information with producers about the best management practices, best ways to control estrus, kind of a local version of what we deliver in our Applied Reproductive Strategies meeting.
And then as you were speaking about reproductive technologies and how the advancements would allow for, the creation of maybe that replacement heifer that you need more efficiently in a lesser amount of time, it made me think about the herd liquidation that we currently have going on and how that's going to have prolonged effects. So an opportunity like this would help in those situations, right?
Well, yeah, anytime hopefully, if you have to liquidate to deal with your lack of forage, at some point, hopefully that producer is going to come back, and the ability, how they might go about that might be different next year or whenever they're able to restock than it was, 20 years ago because of the tools that we have. And in my mind, and I have no data to prove this, but, just use of AI in our beef industry in general has lifted all of our herds because our seed stock providers are working hard on genetic selection, and that is spread out through the rest of the herd. We've made some big changes, and genetic improvement and artificial insemination in the industry as a whole has been a big part of that.
Like you've mentioned before, there's such an opportunity for growth within this area of reproductive technology, right? But there's some obvious barriers when it comes to what we can do as an industry. So where do you hope to see those changes made to overcome those barriers?
Right. So it's a combination both on the genetic side and the reproductive technologies. So editing genes as well as trying to produce in vitro embryos, those types of things. So that's that intersection. But we also have the public has to accept the product that we're producing. And people tend to be afraid of technology. The first in vitro produced human, that was a big deal. It's taken a long time for genetically engineered salmon to become accepted. They were essentially approved long ago, but people are afraid of what they don't know. And we do need to be very good stewards of this technology. And, I don't think anybody on the science side is wanting to unleash some, monster. But the misconceptions and the science now is pretty deep, to understand the editing and what really is being changed and not changed. Really, some of the things they're doing is no different than what might occur in a natural mutation. So We need to elevate the education of our population to help them understand some of the things that we're doing. The fear of the unknown is always challenging. And so we need to be good stewards, but we need to look at improving our regulations and how we look at some of these things with today's science. A lot of times our regulations are written the perspective of older science, okay? And so we know more now, so our regulations and things need to reflect that, but it'll take some time and just something we'll have to deal with so that we can use some of these to improve our food supply and feeding the world's population.
Sandy, if listeners are tuning in right now and they're wanting more information when it comes to some of the reproductive technologies that we use, we obviously mentioned the meeting coming up August 30th and 31st, and that would be a great opportunity, and I'll have the link for that in today's show notes of today's program. But any other opportunities that you feel like they would need to check out?
Well, we have a website, beefrepro.org, that lists that program, but we also have a place where they can ask questions. We have a lot of information from past meetings, a lot of good links there. We've been doing a monthly webinar series from January to June, and we'll probably continue that, and those are posted and available as well. So lots of things for you to use as resources.
Of course, as always, those resources will be linked, like I said, in the show notes of today's program, and that can be found on agtoday.net. So if you're looking for more information, be sure to check that out. But Sandy, thank you so much for your time.
You bet. It's a pleasure to be here and visit with you.
Absolutely. Once again, that was Sandy Johnson. She is a beef reproductive specialist here at K-State, speaking on reproductive technologies in an upcoming meeting. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back with Sarah Lancaster. She is a weed science specialist here at K-State. So we're going to start off reviewing some of the Kara Summer Field Days that you got to help out with. This was a week or so ago at this point, but still a really cool experience.
Yeah, so it's been a couple of weeks ago now, but it is one of our big extension programming activities for the summer. Partner with CARA, the Ag Retailers Association, and we bring in CCAs of all ages and experience levels and talk about a variety of things.
And you were covering what topic?
So I talked about a couple of different things during the field days. We talked about herbicide symptomology and went through some of the important groups of herbicides and talked about how they work and what to look for in the field. So, thinking crop scouting, you might get called out to evaluate crop injury and just trying to discern what's herbicide and which herbicide caused it versus some sort of other cause of crop injury. So we did that. And then we spent some time talking about the herbicide-resistant grain sorghum systems, and we took a little deep dive into the adjuvants that are required for those systems. I kind of joke that I was in grad school during the Roundup era, so there's a lot of things that my predecessors knew by heart that we're having to kind of relearn as we move out of the glyphosate era of weed control.
Sure, yeah. Something that I think the whole industry is still coming to terms with in terms of learning how to adjust and things like that. And with that, there's there's still a need to control some of those major weeds, one of those being Palmer Amaranth, right?
Right. So, there's quite a bit of buzz around the new herbicide-resistant grain sorghum systems. I think I came on and talked about those systems with Eric maybe last winter. And so the three main systems, there's Enzen is the trait name that has been around for a while. There's the iGrowth system that is new, and there's the Double Team system, which is new. So even though we have some additional herbicides available for weed control in grain sorghum, really those systems are focusing on grass control. So yeah, we're still going to need additional herbicides to manage things like Palmer Amaranth in our grain sorghum crop.
When it comes to those herbicide-resistant grain sorghum technologies that you're working with, there's still some herbicides that are available for use in those systems. What are some of those? Yeah,
so those systems, Samantha, are developed around, specific herbicides, right? So in the iGrowth system, the herbicide that can be used there is branded as Imiflex, and the active ingredient is a Mazamox, which is the same thing as, for example, Raptor in soybeans. It's also the same thing as Beyond in Clearfield wheat and Clearfield sunflowers. And then the other one to really focus in on probably is the double team system. And the herbicide that's labeled for that system is called First Act. The active ingredient is quizalofop, which is the same thing as Assure, which is used in soybeans. It's also the active ingredient in the herbicide Aggressor that's used in coaxium wheat. And so, one of the points that we really make when we talk about these herbicide-resistant grain sorghum systems is that, they're exciting new technology, but we have to be extra careful about stewarding that technology because we're already using it in wheat, and a lot of our grain sorghum is grown in rotation with wheat. So just recognizing that even though we might be rotating crops, we also need to make sure we're rotating herbicide systems so that we're not speeding up the selection of resistant weeds in our fields.
Sure, we've already run into that problem just as it is already. So when we start crossing some of these products when it comes to their use and what programs they can be implemented to, it's kind of a double-edged sword there. You're benefiting, but at the same time, it's like, are we risking building the resistance of this?
Yeah, double-edged sword is a good terminology for, a lot of things in life, right?
Yeah, I've been using it a lot today.
But I think they are exciting new tools, but I do think any new privilege comes with extra responsibilities,
sure.
Right? I put on my mom hat for a minute. And I think the same thing holds true with these technologies. They're exciting new opportunities, but they do come with some additional responsibilities.
Absolutely something to keep in mind while we're thinking about that. And it's also, this concern is less manageable as the heat increases, which we've seen obviously in the last week or so over triple digits across the majority of the state, which is crazy to think about.
Yeah, so, weed management in grain sorghum, post-emergent weed management in grain sorghum is really a challenge and something that folks have to stay on top of. With all crops, we emphasize the importance of residual herbicides at planting, but that's super important with grain sorghum because we have so few post-emergence herbicides, and really the ones that we have, it's super critical to get them applied when the weeds like Palmer Amaranth are very small. So it's definitely a challenge, and the heat just exacerbates those challenges.
So when it comes to controlling Palmer Amaranth, what are some of the tips that you have for producers?
So, again, rule number one is to make sure that you're using a solid pre-emergence herbicide application with multiple effective modes of action against Palmer Amaranth. In grain sorghum, much like corn, that's going to look something like atrazine with a group 15 herbicide. So that could be metolachlor, that could be acetochlor, or that could be a dimethenamide product like Outlook. And then as we think about coming back post-emergence, again, targeting small weeds, so sort of a planned early post-emergence herbicide application can be important because the herbicide options that you have would be to come back with some additional atrazine if you have not already exceeded your annual application rates with your pre-emergence application. Other products would be things like AIM. So AIM is a group 14 herbicide. It needs a lot of coverage. Small weeds are very important there. 2,4-D and dicamba are also options. They get used fairly regularly, but the downside with those two herbicides, Samantha, is that they have a lot of crop response. You can get some onion leafing, you can get brittle stems that are going to be more likely to blow over in a windstorm. So, we need to take some precautions when we're using those products, but they can help manage things like Palmer Amaranth. The last two options then would be an application of bromoxynil by itself, or an application of Husky, which is a premix of bromoxynil with pyrosulfatol, which is a HPPD inhibiting or a group 27 herbicide. So the Husky application can be effective on smaller pigweeds. Again, that's a case where we have to get the adjuvant package right. If we want to maximize control, we need to apply those products with both ammonium sulfate and a non-ionic surfactant. The other thing to be aware of is that Husky applications are very likely to cause some crop response. Again, just some discoloration on the leaves, and that crop is going to look a little tough for a few days after that application. But, you mentioned the heat, and I think as we talk about Husky, it's important to recognize that that's a product that it could be especially important to apply in the morning. A few years back, there was some research done at K-State by Dr. Jugulam, and the research found that Palmer Amaranth actually metabolizes group 27 herbicides faster when it's hotter. And so basically that means the herbicide doesn't have enough time to work in the plant before it gets broken down and compartmentalized by the plant. So one of the things you can do if you choose to use Husky in your grain sorghum application would be to make sure that you're making that application earlier in the morning. The plants then theoretically have had time to recover from the heat stress of the previous day and are going to be more apt to metabolize that herbicide the way we want them to.
Absolutely. And we've talked on the program before about the importance of considering heat when it comes to herbicide application. So that's obviously a consideration for all of these, but especially, like you mentioned, for husky in that case.
Yeah, just a interesting and important thing that we can think about to try to maximize the effectiveness of that application.
Absolutely. And if listeners are wanting to learn more about heat and herbicide application and some of your tips when it comes to that, they can go back and listen to that previous episode we did. That was a few weeks ago, last month or so, I think.
Yeah, early June.
Yeah, so you can find that on agtoday.net. If you go to our podcast and kind of scroll through some of those programs, our past programs, you should be able to find it there, and we can link it in this program as well. You've mentioned all of these different considerations. What should some of those priorities be when producers are thinking about, well, how do I really want to attack this?
So we had an interesting conversation at the Cara Field Days last week. Someone asked me, at what point do you just have to live with some crop response, some crop injury in order to get good weed control? And I think we're at that point where these Palmer Amaranth are resistant to a lot of herbicides, and the cost of not getting a good kill on the palmer is probably greater than the cost of the crop injuries. So I think, again, having folks start with a program, a weed management program that includes a solid pre-emergence application, and then just doing the absolute best to get out on small weeds with an additional residual herbicide in that post-emergence application is going to be super key.
Is this kind of the prime time when it comes to making sure we're catching those post-emergence kind of plants, or have we missed that goal by this point?
One of the things, Samantha, that's important to consider with these post-emergence applications is that they all have some restrictions as far as what is the latest that they can be applied, right? Mm-hmm. And so, for example, for atrazine, it's 12 inches. For 2,4-D, we want 5 to 10 inches, but we also want to make sure that we can use drop nozzles if it's taller than 8 inches. For bromoxynil, it's all the way through the boot stage. For husky, it's all the way through 30 inches. So, again, just good agronomy, making sure you're aware of the growth stage of your crop, then going back and figuring out what herbicides are still available at that time.
Absolutely. Well, Sarah, if listeners are tuning in and they're wanting more information on this, where can they find that? Because I know you recently wrote an Agronomy E-Update about this topic.
Yeah, that's right. So this article showed up in the Agronomy E-Update. I think it's been 2 weeks ago now, actually, Samantha. And the other place that I like to encourage folks to look is the Chemical Weed Control Guide. So that's available through the KSRE bookstore. They can just Google 2022 Chemical Weed Control Guide for Kansas, and they'll get right to it.
Excellent. Well, as always, those will be linked in today's show notes. We'll make sure to link both that Agronomy E-Update article as well as the Weed Control Guide. Of course, those will be linked in today's show notes on agtoday.net. But Sarah, thank you so much, as always, for your time. It's always fun chatting with you.
Yep. Thanks, Samantha.
Once again, that was Sarah Lancaster. She is a weed science specialist here at K-State, speaking to us about herbicide-resistant grain sorghum technology as well as controlling Palmer Amaranth. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are ending this Wednesday's programming, as always, with our Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Expert segment. This week, it is hosted by Brad White, Brian Lubers, and Bob Larson, and they're covering bovine anaplasmosis.
Hi, welcome to our BCI Ask the Experts on the Ag Today program. I'm Brad White, joined today by a couple experts, and our format for this is you send us your question, and we get the experts to weigh in on their opinion, and then they get points to see who gave the better answers. Today's experts are Dr. Brian Lubers, who's a veterinarian and does food animal therapeutics here at K-State.
Hi, everybody.
And Dr. Bob Larson, also a veterinarian here at K-State.
Hello.
So we're happy to have them with us because we're going to discuss anaplasmosis today. And anaplasmosis is a disease that affects many cow-calf herds. Before I get to our listener question, Brian, could you give me a little background on anaplasmosis?
Yeah, and certainly there's lots of information about anaplasmosis, lots of good extension bulletins. But the short version is anaplasmosis is a parasite that affects the red blood cells. From the producer perspective, the challenge with it is that those red cells are identified as not right by the host animal, or in this case the cow, and their body removes them from. So it's a disease that causes anemia or low blood cell counts because of this parasite.
And those red blood cells carry oxygen, which means they will act depressed, be away from the herd. So our question from a listener is, and this can be a herd disease, what are the best things that I can do to try to manage anaplasmosis on my ranch? Bob, you go first.
I think one of the things is to really know your risk in your area. we've seen some areas of Kansas in the last few years where kind of anaplasmosis moved into the area and it caused problems where it wasn't causing problems before. And that's when it's probably the most challenging. And so we do manage this disease differently if you're in a high-risk area versus a low-risk area. So first of all is kind of really know what your situation is, and is it a kind of endemic, gonna-live-with-it problem, or is it a problem that you want to try to keep out as long as you can because it's pretty rare in your area? So kind of knowing your situation helps you at least begin your planning project.
Brian?
Yeah, I think the challenge with that is, so we didn't talk about this, it's actually spread by biting insects. So ticks, maybe flies, can be spread by injection needles, using palpation sleeves multiple times. It's really hard to keep out because of that. So there is some immunity that develops naturally. There is a vaccine that's you can use it conditionally depending on where you are, so you have to get approval. It's just hard to do that. So a lot of times we do just end up living with it. So if it's in your herd, usually the first year you have it is the worst as far as really bad clinical signs, and then it seems to get better. And there are some therapeutics that we use to treat it, tetracycline class drugs. They seem to be effective, but there's just not good research there.
Okay, I'm going to give you both 7 points for that first round because yes, those things are all true. I have to know my herd and I have to understand what tools are out there. But now I want you to focus it on me. What can I do on my operation tomorrow to make things better? And you've got 30 seconds. Go, Bob.
If you live in an area where anaplasmosis is really common, I would be very careful about bringing in animals that are naive or that haven't been exposed before, because they're going to be exposed at your place and they haven't built that long-term kind of stability that minimizes or manages the problem. So again, I'd be careful about bringing in low-risk cattle to a high-risk area.
Excellent. Brian?
This is such a disease challenge. It really is hard. I'll give up the points. I agree with Bob. I do. I think it's so hard to manage, and we've been working on it for a long time, and we really haven't come up with a great solution. So I think, although I think it's likely to fail over many, many, many years, but I think good biosecurity is probably your best option.
Absolutely. And both of you address biosecurity, so I will take your points and give them to Bob.
That's fine.
Bob's going to win the day, which he's excited about. But I think some of the take-homes here are know your area, know the disease and how it may impact your operation, control the animals coming in to your operation. And like any time we have a lot of tools, there may be no one tool that singularly takes care of the problem. We thank you for joining us again today, and if there are any questions you have you'd like us to talk about in the future, send us an email at bci@ksu.edu.
Once again, that was the Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Expert segment here on Agriculture Today, covered this week by Brad White, Brian Lubers, and Bob Larson. We'll be back with more tomorrow. For Agriculture Today, I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network.